Philosophers talk to our times. We citizens of dystopia. If I had to think for a moment, what was it that made us dystopia? When did we fall? It would be that moment, strangely enough, when the discourse of political hate slipped out of the control of politicians. I mean it. You see, part of the post-war consensus was that the enemy within was a phrase that was either dismissed entirely because we'd all fought through the war together, or it was confined very carefully to certain groups. Oh, I mean, for instance, Margaret Thatcher absolutely used that phrase. And I remember when she did it, it was incandescent. It was the first moment we climbed the rung up to this dystopia of ours. But she and her ally Murdoch used it about one group within society. I mean the miners, the trade unionists, those who are actually fighting for their rights, who didn't simply want to be run over by the express of the kind of capitalism that Thatcher wanted just to unleash on an unhappy and undeserving world. But that was perhaps the first moment. But then for what? From 1980 to I think about 2008, there was a real control on behalf of the political classes, which I suppose I include journalists within, about those who we were meant to hate. I mean within the state. I perhaps should have said this more clearly. That for me, what makes a dystopia truly dystopic, chaotic, dangerous, is that the others, that invocation of the enemy that is such a feature of Fahrenheit 451 or 1984, becomes polyverse. There are many different sources of enemy and moves firmly inside the state, so that you're no longer fighting the enemy you have always fought beyond the walls of the state, but rather the hidden within. And in America, I think the story is ever so slightly different, because there, of course, the enemy was the have you now or have you ever been part of the Communist Party. And that was the enemy, the great Satan, that they were fighting for from the 1950s onwards, I suppose. But again, it was all screwed down. The political classes stoked the hate. The journalists ensured their voice of hatred got out. And ipso facto, the enemy within was known, clear, obvious. And then what happened? I suppose the first crack of this alliance might have been the internet. I mean, I remember the internet for that moment of joy when we were all going to talk to each other and work out our differences one to the other. We'd all get caught up then in the world of radio, of listening to each other's radio and podcasts, and learn so much. But it opened up opportunities for hate mongers to put forward different hypotheses from those that were put out by the media. And absolutely conspiracy started to grow. Of course it did. And with it, the ability of politicians to actually be in control of what was loathed slipped. But I think I would probably put key the huge injustice of the banking crisis that created right at the heart of a political establishment an unsayable truth, an unthinkable truth within the system that we live, which was, of course, that those who arguably created the crisis by allowing for loans that should never have been, I mean the bankers, did incredibly well out of the crisis that they had created. More than that, they ascended into positions of power, so that the self-same folk who had betted against the British economy became British Prime Ministers, British Chancellors. They ran the Tory party of Boris Johnson. And that injustice, while inflicting elsewhere poverty on the system, those who had never actually done anything wrong than aspire to a better life were now caned and hit with endless austerity that created desperation, that created hatred. And this, of course, was a truth unthinkable. You couldn't say it, because the moment you said it, then you would be on that violent revolutionary trope. And of course, some people like me did say it, and we othered straight away. The enemy now became very clearly a political banking class. And so we gained our enemy. But if you wanted to stop that enemy, that definition of society sweep, you had to, of course, start to look for other enemies, which is why the discourse about endless illegal immigration really starts to pick up at the end of Gordon Brown, when the BNP start to win local councils. Well, history repeats itself, don't you find? And there was an entire discourse, a new discourse, a fear of the foreigner coming in, just as everybody knew that austerity was going to hit. And of course, the Tories stoked that. They stoked it in order to drive Brexit. But really, in the Brexit debate in Britain, they lost control of the hatred. Because they simply blamed everything on Europe and said, project your own fears, your own hatred onto Europe. And people did. They would find endless reasons to loathe Europe, to link it to the rise of immigration. The rise of the kind of immigration they really didn't like. I mean, the immigration by the poor to their wealthy land, for those folk that would steal what they had. And hatred started to abound. Political parties then stopped being the masters of hatred and became their servants. That was, of course, behind the entire post-Brexit arguments within Britain. Those politicians who were best able to cultivate the hates that has already existed, to write them and say, well, I will be the answer to it, I will solve it, started to do well. I think that Trump would have done the same in 2016. And then COVID hit. And COVID was the moment it all changed, because any pretense at the ability on behalf of the political classes to control any discourse of hatred simply collapsed. They became caught up. They assumed that vaccination would be popular. And when stoked up by fear and loathing, by a feeling that this would never end, that somehow somebody somewhere had caused it, for a large chunk of the population, vaccination was rejected, hated, feared, loathed, seen to be part of the chemical industry. Parties simply went along with it. They started to go along with the hatreds of their people. And more than that, in order to gain political power, they opened the gates of loathing. So that our society has become typified by internal groups hating one another. Whether us on the left who have been fairly stable on our loathing of bankers. Now, you will have noticed, at least I hope you will have noticed, that I have an ambivalence about that. I have an ambivalence partly born possibly from my caste. These people I went to university with. But more from simply that I tend to blame structural systems rather than the shit that make money out of them. Oh, they're loathsome little turds. But making them into monsters, no. It's the system that monsters them. I'm a good Marxist that way. But anyway, it became very easy to blame bankers and beyond them billionaires for all the world's problems. Just guillotine them and somehow we'll all be happier. Well, on the other side, once you kicked away the world of sanity, and once you abolished all control over who was hated, you ended up into a hell's kitchen, where the very poorest in society were blamed for all the world's ills, where science itself became hated, loathed, medicine feared. Everything could be feared and loathed. Everything could be built into a conspiracy because the gates of hatred had been thrown open. And more than that, politicians, in order to gain power, had to stoke up hate. You can see the failure, the fundamental failure of the establishment to keep the hatred, to keep in control of hatred through the fate of the Labour Party trying to stoke what they call anti-Semitism. They can't do it. Now, I agree Netanyahu is a pillock and a shit, and again, I have him on my hate list. However, it is also true that there is genuinely rather a lot of... It is more dangerous, I think I would say, to be Jewish in Britain and in France and in America now than at any other time, and innocent of any blood. That is actually true. And yet it is a thought my side would find difficult to think. And actually it becomes impossible then for the government to say, let's loathe this group, the anti-Semites, because they can't control the discourse of hatred anymore. They've lost control of it. And it is that makes us a dystopia. that inability just to argue, to debate, that inability then of politicians to control who we loathe. They follow who we hate, and the gates of hell open up.